you have access to some railroad tracks, at least here in the US, you probably have just about unlimited access to steel for forging. It's kind of funny how the most efficient form of transportation is so wasteful with its steel. You'll find these railroad spikes strewn about at random from when they replace the wooden ties. That one's not worth the trouble, but you get the idea. They're everywhere. Now, I'd always thought that these tracks were too recent to have any wrought iron, but the other day I was walking along here and I found some interesting looking steel, actually a lot like this, that had the characteristic layers of wrought iron. And later on I found out the tracks have been around since maybe the 1860s. We've got the more modern set here, and there's an older narrow gauge line that you can still see in parts over here, and that's where the wrought iron would be coming from. Here's some of the old narrow gauge track down in the woods. This would be far from original, it's definitely steel, but this is where the line would have been. It's a little too much trouble to search for metal in the leaves around here, so I tend to look up there in the dirt where the erosion exposes more of the older stuff. Just for comparison, I'm going to pick up a couple of spikes from either line. So this is a narrow gauge spike, and this is a regular gauge spike from the new tracks. And we know the new tracks are more modern. Those are definitely going to be steel. The narrow gauge spikes that are smaller could be steel or wrought iron. But you can tell from the way this pits rather than flaking apart that this is a steel one. We're looking for the flaky structure of wrought iron. I don't know how many times I've come back here over the years, but it never seems to get any harder to find spikes, like just in this one spot. Got one narrow gauge spike just in the gravel ballast, and two pretty clean newer spikes right next to each other. In high school at some point I went back here and gathered about 75 for an art project, and it didn't seem to make a dent. This is the kind of thing I'm looking for often when I am trying to find the narrow gauge spikes that could be wrought. You can see this one is awfully corroded, so it's like almost doubled its volume really with iron oxide. So what I like to do when I find these is smash them open against the rails, and that'll show us if the structure is more indicative of wrought iron or steel. So for comparison here, we've got our pretty definite piece of wrought iron, a fresh piece of steel, a less fresh piece of steel, and a more corroded piece of steel. And that's what this one would look like if it ends up being steel. Underneath all the crust, this does appear to have layers to it, so that's a good indicator this might be wrought. Probably going to have to take it back to the shop and do a spark test to be sure. Yeah, I'd say that one's almost definitely wrought. That's real prominent grain structure there. It can be difficult to tell sometimes because even forged steel does have a grain structure. If you were to section it and etch it, you would see a definite profile in the way the metal was moved. But with normal corrosion just sitting in the ground, it doesn't tend to be that prominent. You see much more of this pitting. Alright, so we've got two spikes here, one that is definitely modern steel and one that is suspected to be wrought iron. Now if that one is wrought iron, you should be able to tell the difference between the sparks they make when they're held up to the grinder. And normally that would be the preferred method of identification because it doesn't remove a whole lot of the material. But since I haven't done it that way before, I'm going to do a little destructive test where I can be a little more certain. I'm just going to make a little cut at the base of the spike and clamp it in the vise, hammer it over until it breaks. And it should splinter and fracture kind of like wood because of that layered structure. And if it does end up being wrought iron, I can use it as my go-to sample for when I do spark tests to identify new material. Wow. Well, that seems to have fucked up the hacksaw blade pretty quickly. That might actually be an indicator already that this is wrought, because I'm pretty sure I've heard that wrought iron is really wear resistant compared to modern mild steel. All the stringy inclusions of silica make it like trying to cut through metal filled with sand. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying wrought iron is any better than modern steel. The silica strings actually make it really weak. It fractures in a brittle fashion rather than ductile like modern steel. So it just kind of suddenly snaps rather than stretching and elongating before it breaks. And that breaking strength is lower overall as well. We're going to do the steel first as control because this is super scientific. But also just to show the difference in case this other one does end up being wrought. So you can see that's, I don't want to say a clean fracture, but it is pretty uniform. It looks kind of like looking at sand, honestly. Now let's try this older spike. And I would say that is almost definitely wrought iron. So there's the two for comparison. You got the mild steel, relatively uniform, and the iron, which definitely looks flakier. Now the spark test for future reference. The steel first. Now the iron. So the steel, you could see, had a good number of sparks that flew away for a little bit and then popped kind of like a firework. And the iron had, as far as I could tell, 0 of those. This is my haul of likely wrought iron after probably under an hour of lazy searching. Wanted to point out one more thing to look out for, and that is that steel can get really flaky as it corrodes too. But you can still tell the difference after chipping some of it off. You can see the wrought iron, even underneath all of the flakes after pounding it off, you can still kind of see those layers. Whereas steel will be either smooth or slightly pitted. So if you have access to your own railroad tracks, chances are nobody's going to yell at you for picking up their scraps. It's a good source of metal whether you're looking for forging stock or something to use as an anvil. None of it's going to be particularly hard, but neither is anything else I've been using as an anvil, and it's worked out fine so far. I would advise practicing forge welding on newer steel railroad spikes like this. They're going to be a lot easier to find, and they're actually harder to weld than old wrought iron. But since you're not going to be finding as much of this, I would advise practicing on the cheap, easy to find stuff. You can't really just go out buying wrought iron because nobody makes it anymore, so I plan on waiting until I'm a little more experienced to work with the stuff I found. So that's about all I got. It's not a great material, but it's good for forging, and if you live by some railroad tracks, go check them out. Maybe you'll get lucky and they'll be old enough to have some of your own wrought iron. Go. Get off your ass, you lazy sack of shit.